I'm Charvi Narayan. I'm an editor for Nature Neuroscience. We are at the 79th Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Symposium on Quantitative Biology, and this year's topic is Cognition. And today I'm joined by Ledoux at NYU, who's going to talk about a sort of new twist in the very old topic on fear and how it works in the human brain.
Right, so I've been working on fear for roughly 30 years, and after all that time I decided I hadn't been working on fear at all.
I see.
So it's kind of a wrinkle, but if you look back over the way I've talked about fear all these years, the idea has been in there the whole time. So basically, I think what we study when we study animals, and also often when we're studying humans as well, is the processes in the brain that detect and respond to danger. Mm-hmm. And fear is something additional. It's the ability of the conscious brain to apprehend that the stuff under the hood has detected and responded to danger, and to be aware of all the consequences that produces in the brain, in the body, and all of the feedback and all of the other stuff that's going on. It's not just body feedback, but also information from within the brain itself. So I no longer talk about Pavlovian fear conditioning. I talk about Pavlovian threat conditioning, because it's really about how the stimulus has changed in the brain, and how that change allows that stimulus now to produce defense responses. Fear is something we can know and study and talk about in people, but we have no idea what another animal is experiencing. So it's a way to not get hung up on concepts and talk about concepts in animals that lead to treatments and all sorts of other things that may be inappropriate in people because of the conflation of cognitive conscious fear with these threat detection and response mechanisms. So, for example, people go to therapists and seek treatment because they feel bad, right? Mm-hmm. They have conscious sensations and feelings that they don't want to have. But those are being caused by systems underneath. And if we mix those two things up, those two things might be treatable in different ways. So you might want to first separately treat the underlying stuff.
And would that be more akin to threat detection? So are you saying that there's a threat detection which is separate, and there's the cognitive sort of stuff which goes with threat detection, which deserves the label fear?
Right.
Would that be correct?
That's pretty close to it, yeah. So there a lot of the treatment is cognitive behavioral treatment, but I think that mixes two things together. You need to separate those. They used to be separate. Originally, behavioral therapy was just extinction. Mm-hmm. And I think that was probably the way to do it. You extinguish the responses, and then you deal with the cognitions. But that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. So maybe I should kind of switch gears.
What made you sort of realize that there's this difference? So after 30 years of work,
it's just been sort of gnawing away at me. Kind of like an almost imperceptible itch I've been wanting to scratch. Because I've always said that the conscious feeling of fear is something that involves attention and working memory and all kinds of cognitive processes. The mistake I made was calling what the amygdala does the fear system, because I'm guilty in this mess as well. So.
Well, I think in that sense, almost everybody is.
Yeah, well, but it's I think we're at a point where we've made a lot of progress, and a sharper conception of what we're really studying and talking about would help the field really advance to the next level.
What sort of implications do you think this has for sort of animal models of fear? Because if you're talking about fear as a sort of conscious perception.
Well, I would no longer call them animal models of fear. I would call a spade, and say that it's very, very relevant for human fear and anxiety, but we're not studying those processes that people feel and experience. What we want to do is understand how those things are happening, because they're fundamental to those experiences, but they have to be kept separate. If we can separate them in the brain, for example, we can condition someone in the lab to a picture and a shock, and then present that picture without them being aware of it. Right? Mm-hmm. So they're unconscious of the stimulus. The stimulus produces a response that we would call a fear response, but the person doesn't feel anything, doesn't even know the stimulus is there. Fear is not what's driving those responses.
I see. And do you think these two things are separable in the brain as well?
Oh,
so
they're absolutely
threat
separable.
detection versus.
Absolutely.
So would you talk about some of the work which shows that these two things are separable?
Well, they're separable, as I said, because we can we can separate them in people.
Right.
So if we don't need conscious fear to explain how threat detection and responding works in a person, we certainly don't need it in a rat. So the idea is to understand the stuff that's relevant in rats and people that's the same, and not start bringing in the human fear into the rat to explain the human fear. If we want to study human fear, we have to study that.
So you previously kind of talked about the amygdala in what I guess you'd now say is more threat detection.
It's a threat detector, yeah.
So where would then the fear center
Fear
be
is, there's a growing movement in psychology called construction theory of emotion.
Right.
And I've been a constructionist since the late 1970s when I worked on split brain patients. But the and that's how I've always interpreted fear, as the conscious putting together of all this stuff coming up underneath the hood into a feeling. And people like Lisa Feldman Barrett, Jim Russell, and a bunch of others are talking about conscious fear now in this way as a social or cognitive construction on the basis of unconscious information. So that's how I think it's coming. It's coming out in cortex and working memory and attention, and all those things have to be brought to bear. If you're not aware of it, you're not feeling. You have to be aware of something to feel it. You can't have an unconscious feeling, I would say.
So fear is a conscious percept.
Right.
There's no such
Exactly.
thing as an unconscious feeling
Right.
of fear. I'm sure you know that there would be many people who sort of disagree with this.
Well, most
with this
people
idea.
don't disagree with it in principle.
Right.
They're reluctant to change because it's hard to change things.
Yeah. So, what is the sort of work do you think you're currently planning again to try and separate out these two things?
Well, I think that we don't need to do any more work to separate them. It's obvious that they're separable. The research that we have now, and I'm writing a book on this now too. So I wrote a paper in PNAS recently called "Coming to Terms with Fear," where it's all explained as well. But so I'm not doing any research to really test this because I think it's it's pretty clear. And as I said, most people agree that this is right, but we don't want to do it because it's just too much trouble.
But how does this idea that what a lot of people call fear in that sense is not? How does this change things? How does it sort of change the assessment of the current?
Right, because if you're telling the people pay for our research, people on the street, the government pays for our research. Mm-hmm. If we tell them that the amygdala is feeling fear, they're getting the wrong impression.
I see.
For example, there was a big splash. I think your journal probably had something on it called "Fearless Woman Feels Fear." Okay, and that kind of was one of the things that kind of got me going, which is that this woman, they were able to induce fear in her even though her amygdala was not present. But the only reason you'd be surprised that you could have fear in the absence of the amygdala is if you believed when you turn on the amygdala you got the feeling of fear. So it's just kind of this conception that's in there, and it leads to research being so we're studying the amygdala of PTSD or panic disorder patients because that's where their feelings of panic and trauma come from, but that's not true. The amygdala, when turned on, activates stress hormone systems, it activates a lot of body systems, it triggers brain arousal, it focuses attention on the threat. It does a lot of stuff that ultimately becomes the feeling of fear, but is not the feeling of fear. The fear is not in the amygdala. Fear is a consequence. It's like you've got a lot of ingredients that are non-emotional ingredients that when put together allows the cognitive brain to make it.
It's a sort of emergent property of
yeah, you could say that.
And how do you think, again, how would you sort of recontextualize the patient work on things like PTSD, or you talked about cognitive behavioral therapy? What sort of implications does this way of thinking have for those things?
That if you put too much cognition into the process of trying to change behavior through extinction, you're putting competing systems at work.
I see.
You need to isolate the extinction process to weaken those bonds so that the stimulus is not going to produce the behavioral response. And once you've done that, then you can address the cognitive. I think if you put it all together, you're dealing with systems that should be separated.
I see. And so now you've had sort of 30 years of work, as you said, looking at fear. What sort of stuff are you planning for the future?
We're doing a lot of work now on how, well, fear, the stuff we've been doing for all these years is reaction. You've got a tone, a shock, the tone elicits a response. It's just an automatic reaction. And that's the implicit stuff that's going on underneath. But now we're looking at how the brain acts in the face of danger. And that's a lot of what I'll be talking about tonight. Different ways that the same stimulus, a tone that's been paired with a shock, can have a variety of other consequences that affect instrumental behaviors, the behaviors that are motivated by some goal.
Great. Well, I look forward to what comes out tonight. Thanks so much. It was
Okay.
great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.